He eased his classic 1968 Mustang into his driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires in a rhythm that, to him, sounded like progress. The sun was sinking low, painting the manicured lawn of his Northwood Estates home in long, golden streaks. Everything was as it should be. The porch light casting a welcoming glow, the mail waiting in the brass box, and his magnificent 8-foot-tall English laurel hedges lining the entire western perimeter. They were his monument to privacy, a dense, verdant wall that had taken him 7 years to cultivate, 7 years of precise trimming, feeding and protection from pests and, more recently, from the relentless gaze of the HOA. He grabbed his briefcase and key fob, but the moment he stepped onto the cool, late-afternoon asphalt, the world tilted. It wasn't a subtle change. It was a violent, ugly amputation, where the majestic, towering wall of deep green foliage had stood, a solid, sound-dampening barrier between his sanctuary and the sterile, cookie-cutter lawn of his neighbor, Brenda Sterling. There was now a jagged, brutalized stump. The hedge was gone, not pruned, massacred. It had been reduced from 8 feet of flourishing life to a miserable knee-high row of skeletal woody limbs. The top surface looked like it had been attacked by a weed whacker wielded by a blind man, leaving the inside of his property sickeningly exposed to the setting sun and, worse, to Brenda's house. Marcus stood frozen, his briefcase slipping from his numb fingers. The sound it made hitting the driveway, a hollow plastic thump, was the only thing that broke the ringing silence in his ears. This wasn't pruning. This was an act of war. He walked slowly toward the property line, his polished leather shoes sinking slightly into a mulch of shredded leaves and broken branches. He ran a hand over the rough, newly exposed wood of a severed trunk. The cut was fresh, the sap still sticky. He felt an intense, physical sickness, the kind that knots the stomach and makes the blood run cold with violation. 7 years. Gone in an afternoon, he knew immediately who was responsible. No rogue landscaper would be this reckless. Only one person in Northwood Estates was capable of weaponized uniformity, armed with a measuring tape and the unquestionable authority of the Architectural Review Committee, Brenda Sterling. Marcus checked his mailbox, his hands trembling. Beneath a stack of junk mail was a thick, ivory-colored envelope sealed with an official HOA crest, the stylized image of a pristine gazebo. He ripped it open. The letter was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive bureaucracy, signed by Brenda Sterling, ARC Chair. Subject: Notice of Immediate Cure and Violation. Case 2024-41B, Perimeter Foliage. Dear Mr. Thorne, your property at 1445 Briarwood Lane was found to be in violation of Covenant 4.2c, which strictly limits hedge height along shared boundary lines to a maximum of 4 feet, 0 inches, for the purpose of maintaining community cohesion and sightline visibility. As per the enclosed resolution, the association was forced to initiate curative maintenance. Marcus crushed the paper in his fist, the expensive cardstock squeaking in protest. They didn't even give him a warning. They simply sent their own crew onto his land and destroyed his property, justifying it with a covenant he had argued against and ignored for years, believing his well-maintained hedges were an implicit exception. He looked across the newly shorn barrier. Brenda Sterling's house was a beige fortress of conformity, its windows glaring back at him in the dying light. And there she was, standing on her porch, watering a potted fern, her back to him. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to. She knew he was home. She knew what he had seen. The watering was a calculated act of disinterest, a deliberate dismissal of his existence. Marcus pulled out his phone, his thumb slamming the call button for the HOA management company. After navigating 3 layers of automated menus, he reached a human being named Gary. Northwood Estates HOA, Gary chirped, sounding entirely too cheerful for the destruction that had just occurred. This is Marcus Thorne at 1445 Briarwood, Marcus said, his voice dangerously low. I need to know who authorized the crew to trespass onto my property and destroy my hedges this afternoon. Gary's cheer evaporated. replaced by the practiced dullness of someone who fields angry homeowner calls daily. Oh, Mr. Thorne, yes. Case 41B. That was the ARC, sir. The hedge was non-compliant with the 4-foot regulation. Non-compliant. It was 8 feet. It's been 8 feet for years, and I never received a warning. You sent a crew onto my private property and committed vandalism. With all due respect, Mr. Thorne, Gary recited, per Section 4.2c, once the violation is certified by the ARC, which happened 3 weeks ago, noted in the resolution, the ARC has the authority to effect immediate remedy to avoid prolonged non-compliance. The cost of the contractor's services, by the way, will be levied on your next quarterly dues. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut. I want to speak to the ARC chair. Now. That would be Mrs. Sterling, sir. But she only takes correspondence via certified mail regarding compliance issues. She is standing on her front porch right now. She is actively flaunting the destruction she caused. This is malicious, Gary. This is a neighbor dispute disguised as a regulation. Marcus was yelling now, the rage finally bubbling over. Sir, please keep your voice down. The ARC operates within the bounds of the master deed. If you wish to appeal the remedial action, you must submit an appeal to the committee in writing within 10 business days. Good day, Mr. Thorne. The line clicked dead. Marcus stood there, heart pounding, the receiver warm against his ear, staring at the ruins of his green sanctuary and the smug back of Brenda Sterling. He hung up, pocketed his phone, and finally looked at his newly exposed yard. The sun, now lower, cast long, intrusive shadows across his formerly shaded patio. He could see directly into Brenda's kitchen, and she could see directly into his living room. The privacy he had so carefully built, the shield against the crushing conformity of the neighborhood, was gone. He realized the true nature of Brenda's crime wasn't the violation of his property, but the violation of his boundary. She had used the HOA's power to force his world to conform to hers, and she was watching. He could feel it. She wanted to see his defeated walk inside, his acceptance of her victory. Instead, a slow, terrifying calm settled over Marcus. The anger didn't dissipate. It sharpened, calcifying into cold, hard intent. Brenda wanted him to comply. She wanted a visible boundary set at 4 feet. She wanted uniformity. Marcus walked back to the street, not toward his door, but toward the curb, where the contractor's truck had left 2 deep tire ruts in his lawn. He pulled his phone back out and dialed the number of the largest construction supply yard in the county. Hi, I need to order some materials, he said, his voice now entirely flat, devoid of emotion. I need cinder blocks. Standard gray, 8x16. I need enough to build a wall 80 feet long and let's make it 10 feet high. Sir, that's a lot of block, the voice on the other end whistled. That's going to be 4 full pallets. Where should we drop them? Marcus looked one last time at the jagged, pathetic remains of his beloved hedge. He stared across the line at Brenda Sterling's house, which now seemed less like a home and more like an observation post. Drop them right on the property line, Marcus instructed. Make sure they're delivered before 8 a.m. tomorrow, and, he paused, a chilling smile touching his lips, I'll also need 50 bags of quick-setting mortar. The stage was set. Brenda wanted a boundary she could see over. Marcus was about to give her one she couldn't see around. The next morning, before the dawn could fully break, the low, powerful rumble of a massive flatbed truck shook Northwood Estates. The delivery driver, a hulking man named Rick, expertly maneuvered his forklift, dropping 4 giant shrink-wrapped pallets of cold, institutional gray cinder blocks exactly on the scarred, violated hedge line. Marcus stood in his bathrobe, sipping coffee, watching the perfect execution of the delivery. The sheer volume of the concrete, hundreds of heavy, unforgiving blocks, was a physical declaration of war. He saw the first flicker of light go on in Brenda Sterling's upstairs bedroom. He didn't flinch. He just nodded to Rick. Looks good, Marcus said. Now I need to know something. Do you have a construction crew? I need a 2-man team here all day starting immediately, and I need to know if they can legally build a fence, or rather a non-living screen, up to 10 feet tall, right on the property line. Rick scratched his chin, looking at the mountain of concrete. Legally? If the city code says 10 feet and you're on the line, you're fine. But the HOA, man, they're gonna lose it, Marcus chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. That's the point, Rick. That's the entire beautiful point, major turning point, as the sun fully rose, casting a harsh light on the neighborhood. The first heavy, mortar-coated cinder block was laid down, square and unforgiving, exactly where the soft, living hedge had once stood. The sound of the trowel hitting the concrete was the sound of Marcus Thorne's total surrender to vengeance and the opening salvo of a long, brutal siege. Brenda Sterling, now standing on her porch, her pastel blazer a stark contrast to the grim gray of the blocks, finally turned and faced him. Her thin smile was gone. Her jaw was slack. She knew at that moment that she had fundamentally misjudged her neighbor. This was no longer a compliance issue. It was personal, and she had just started a fight she was not. The sun was barely above the horizon, but the sound was already deafening. The rhythmic thwack-thwack of trowels against metal, the abrasive scrape of shovels on concrete, and the constant, low conversation of the two construction workers, Rick and his assistant, Mario, drowned out the typical morning quiet of Northwood Estates. Marcus watched the rising structure from his front window, a cold mug of coffee cradled in his hands. The first course of cinder blocks was already complete, running the full 80 feet of the property line. It wasn't just a foundation. It was a psychological marker. It was the line that had been crossed, now marked in gray, unyielding concrete. Brenda Sterling had retreated from her porch, but her presence was a palpable weight. Every curtain on the western side of her house remained closed, yet the tension radiating from her property felt like a microwave hum. She had hoped for compliance, for the gentle defeat of a man forced to accept her 4-foot decree. Instead, she had a monument to his defiance rising in her peripheral vision. By 10 a.m., the crew was on the third course. Rick, a pragmatic man with forearms like cured leather, whistled while he worked, oblivious to the simmering neighborhood drama. "She's staring, boss," Mario muttered, smoothing mortar onto a block. He meant Mrs. Sterling. Marcus didn't need to ask. Marcus stepped outside. The gray blocks, stacked 3 high, were already imposing, cold and raw against the soft green of his lawn. "Let her stare," Marcus said, the word stare tasting metallic on his tongue. He walked to the curb and picked up his newspaper. Halfway back, a pristine white Lexus pulled up and stopped abruptly. The driver's side window purred down, revealing the face of Harold Jensen, the president of the Northwood Estates HOA. Harold was a man who believed order was next to godliness, and whose primary purpose in life seemed to be ensuring that no blade of grass in the community grew outside its predetermined trajectory. Harold's face, usually set in an expression of moderate, polite disapproval, was now tight with genuine panic. "Marcus! What in God's name is this?" Harold's voice, amplified by the car's acoustics, echoed slightly. Marcus walked over, nodding politely. "Good morning, Harold. It's a non-living perimeter screen. It's a wall, Marcus. A giant, ugly fortress wall. It violates the aesthetic standards of the entire community." Harold flung his hand toward the rising structure. "Does it, Harold? Which specific covenant does it violate?" Marcus asked, holding up his coffee cup, taking a deliberate sip. Harold sputtered. "The spirit of the covenant. The spirit of Northwood Estates. We are a community of open sight lines and shared aesthetic values. The spirit of the covenant, as interpreted by the ARC, resulted in the illegal destruction of my property yesterday, Harold," Marcus countered, his voice calm. "My 8-foot English laurel hedge, a living screen that took 7 years to cultivate, was summarily massacred without due process or a proper warning, forcing me into immediate, curative action. I am simply replacing the screen with a non-living barrier of a height permissible by the city and county zoning ordinance, which I consulted prior to this installation." Harold leaned closer, his eyes narrowed. "And what height is that, Marcus?" "You know perfectly well the HOA standard is 4 feet for all boundary fences and screens. The city ordinance for a perimeter screen built on a property line, not designated as a fence, allows up to 10 feet, Marcus stated, crossing his arms. "And since the HOA decided to destroy my previous compliant by exception screen, I am now following the highest legal allowance for privacy I can secure. Harold ran a nervous hand through his perfectly combed silver hair. You think you're clever, Marcus, but you won't get away with this. You needed ARC approval for any structural change over 3 feet. Where is your submission form for a 10-foot cinder block wall? Marcus grinned, a cold, humorless expression. Funny you should mention the ARC, since your chair, Brenda, clearly showed a stunning level of bias and a complete disregard for due process. I considered the ARC utterly compromised and circumvented their review, citing the immediacy of the required remedial action, as defined by your master deed, Section 4.2c, regarding immediate remedy for non-compliant boundary foliage. Harold stared, slack-jawed. Marcus had taken their own procedural weapon and jammed it back into the gears of the HOA machine. You've escalated this, Marcus, Harold said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You know we can fine you into compliance. Then you can fine me, Harold, Marcus shrugged. I have already instructed my attorney to prepare a civil suit for property damage and trespass against the association, citing the willful destruction of my 7-year-old hedge. Your legal fees alone will bankrupt the HOA's reserve fund before my wall reaches 5 feet. Think about that when you levy your first fine. Harold slammed the Lexus into drive without another word. His face pale green and sped away, leaving a faint smell of ozone and panicked formality. By noon, the wall was 6 courses high, 4 feet, the height Brenda had mandated for his hedges. The workers paused for lunch, and Marcus noticed the absence of the typical midday traffic. The street had become a spectator zone, homeowners driving by slowly, pointing, their expressions a mix of horror and grudging admiration. That's when the second attack came, more official than Harold's bluster. A beat-up white sedan, completely out of place in Northwood Estates, parked diagonally across his driveway. A young man in a stiff, ill-fitting uniform stepped out, carrying a clipboard and looking deeply uncomfortable. Mr. Thorne? That's me. I'm from County Zoning and Permits. We received an emergency complaint regarding an unpermitted structure exceeding 4 feet in height. He handed Marcus a bright orange document. Stop work order. Marcus accepted the paper, reading the fine print slowly, a smile growing on his face. This was Brenda's move. Bypass the HOA, go straight to the government. Tactical but amateur. Thank you, officer, Marcus said calmly. I appreciate your promptness. Now, if you look at the bottom of that form, specifically the box labeled Exemptions, you'll see a line for non-living privacy screen. And if you check Section 301D of the County Land Use Code, which I happen to have printed out right here. Marcus retrieved a laminated sheet from his briefcase. It states that non-living privacy screens or baffles constructed of masonry or wood on a property line in R1 residential zones are permitted up to 10 feet in height, provided they do not obstruct primary access or required egress. My wall meets all these requirements. The zoning officer squinted at the laminated sheet, then at his own clipboard, then at the towering gray wall. He scratched his head. Huh. You know your code, Mr. Thorne? I learned it the hard way. When a neighbor, who also happens to be the head of the ARC, decides to unilaterally destroy your landscaping and claim it was an immediate cure, you learn the rulebook inside and out, Marcus said, aiming the line directly at Brenda's curtained window. The officer, eager to escape the conflict, quickly scribbled on the form. All right, well, as long as you adhere to the 10-foot max, you're compliant with the county. I'll need to remove the stop work order. He peeled the orange sticker off the cinder block and sheepishly retreated to his car. Marcus stood beside the rising wall, triumphant. He had just won the first 2 skirmishes, the HOA president's intimidation and the county's legal challenge. He felt a fierce, primal satisfaction. The wall was his shield, and every block laid was a direct refutation of Brenda's authority. That evening, the wall stood 8 courses high, 5.5 feet. The workers had gone, but the conflict had only intensified. Marcus was grilling a steak on his newly exposed patio when his phone rang. It was Harold Jensen again, but this time he was hosting a conference call. Marcus, you are now talking to the full Northwood Estates Board. Harold's voice crackled, stiff with manufactured formality. We have reviewed the situation. Your attempt to circumvent the ARC is noted. Your claim of immediate remedy is considered specious. As such, the board has voted to enact a special fine schedule. A woman Marcus recognized as Sarah, the treasurer, spoke next, her voice sharp. Effective immediately, Marcus. You are fined $500 per day until the structure is brought into compliance with the Northwood Estates 4-foot boundary fence standard. Marcus calmly flipped his steak. I hear you, Sarah. Are you aware that a per-day fine structure is considered highly punitive and often illegal in this state without a court injunction? We are aware of the risk, Harold jumped in, desperation creeping into his tone. But we are also prepared to place a lien on your property within 30 days of non-payment. This is a matter of community integrity, Marcus. Marcus pulled the steak from the grill. Let me be perfectly clear, Harold and Sarah. You have assessed me $500 a day to build a 10-foot wall that the county has already signed off on. My attorney, however, has calculated that the replacement cost, including 7 years of cultivation time, for the property you destroyed, is approximately $25,000. My lawsuit against the HOA for trespass and vandalism is ready to file. He paused, letting the sizzling of his steak fill the line. Here is my counteroffer, Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm, a terrifying calm replacing the earlier anger. You drop the fines, you drop the lien threat, and you pay for the replacement of my original hedge. I will cap the cinder block wall at 7 feet 4 inches. That's 1 inch. The sun was a malevolent collaborator. It rose higher, turning the fluorescent safety yellow paint on Marcus's newly erected wall into a chaotic, blinding beacon. The alternating pattern of raw gray concrete and brilliant caustic yellow didn't just offend the eye. It assaulted it, creating a visual buzz that seemed to vibrate in the morning air. Northwood Estates was quiet, but it was a brittle, fractured quiet. Neighbors who usually wave politely now slowed their cars to a crawl, their mouths slightly agape. Delivery drivers stopped to take pictures. Marcus, sitting on his porch swing with his third coffee, watched the spectacle with clinical detachment. The wall was 7 feet 4 inches of pure, passive-aggressive spite, legal, permanent, and utterly hideous. At 7:45 a.m., a tense tableau was unfolding in the sterile, windowless conference room of the HOA management office 3 miles away. Harold Jensen, the president, looked like a man who hadn't slept, his silver hair slightly askew. Sarah, the treasurer, was frantically reviewing the HOA reserve budget on her tablet, her face pale and Brenda Sterling. The RC chair was incandescent with fury, pacing the room like a caged panther in a pink and white floral suit. He is threatening us! Extortion! Brenda slammed her hand on the polished mahogany table, making the water glasses jump. We cannot capitulate to this man. If we accept his terms, every homeowner will think they can violate the master deed and hold us hostage with frivolous lawsuits. Harold massaged his temples. It's not frivolous, Brenda. Marcus's lawyer, Mr. Cohen, is one of the best property litigators in the state, and the hedge destruction was technically illegal trespass. You didn't give him the required written warning period stipulated in Section 4.1e. You relied on the immediate cure clause, but that's for things like actively leaking oil or noxious weeds, not established landscaping. I relied on my judgment, she hissed. That monstrous hedge ruined the entire sightline. It was suffocating the neighborhood. And now look! He's built an ugly, towering yellow fortress. Sarah finally looked up from her tablet, her voice low and strained. The fines won't work, Brenda. We have $42,000 in the general fund. At $500 a day, he will accrue $15,000 in fines this month alone. But if he files that $25,000 lawsuit for property damage, our deductible alone will be $10,000, and the defense attorney's retainer is another $5,000. We will bankrupt the HOA to fight an ugly but county-compliant wall. It's not just the money, Harold said, standing up. It's the precedent. If we lose the suit, it opens us up to future claims for selective enforcement. We will become a laughingstock. If we pay him, we lose the war. Brenda retaliated, her eyes blazing. We need to countersue for the emotional distress and devaluation of surrounding property caused by the noxious nature of that fluorescent paint. I bet there's a covenant against unconventional color schemes or disturbing visual elements. Harold shook his head wearily. We checked. The exterior paint covenant applies to houses, not to legally designated perimeter screens. And disturbing visual elements is too vague for a court. Marcus is using compliance as a weapon. He found the one loophole, the one thing we can't touch. Sarah slid her tablet across the table, tapping the screen. We have 20 minutes until his 8 a.m. deadline to file. I vote we take his deal. Settle the $25,000 claim for a reduced amount, say $10,000 to replace the destroyed hedge, and he agrees to cap the wall at 7.4 and removes the signage threat. We need to save the reserve fund. And let him keep the yellow? Brenda cried, aghast. He's proven he can keep it, Harold stated flatly. But we can negotiate the color after the legal threat is resolved. We are currently facing litigation. We must prioritize fiscal survival. So you want me to admit defeat? To let this common vandal win? Brenda's voice was barely a whisper, thick with disbelief. Brenda, Harold said, looking her straight in the eye, you created this problem. You committed the initial trespass. The board is now voting to protect the community's finances. Harold and Sarah raised their hands simultaneously. 2 votes to 1. The settlement was approved. At 7:58 a.m., Marcus's phone buzzed. It was his attorney, Mr. Cohen. They caved, Marcus. Cohen's voice was crisp. The HOA has agreed to a full settlement. They drop all fines, waive all lien threats, and they will cut a check for $15,000 for the replacement cost of your hedge. In exchange, you withdraw the lawsuit and agree to maintain the current wall height of 7 feet, 4 inches. Marcus smiled, looking at the blinding yellow wall. It was a victory measured not in feet, but in the delicious sound of Brenda Sterling's defeat. He had won his privacy back, and he had won a hefty check for his troubles. Accept the terms, Mr. Cohen, Marcus said. But inform Harold that since they did not accept the offer before the 8 a.m. deadline, the provision regarding the signage is still in effect. I am legally permitted to install that sign. Marcus, don't push it, Cohen warned. We got the money. Just take the win. The money is the settlement. The sign, Marcus said, standing up and walking to the edge of the curb, is the message. At precisely 8:05 a.m., a second, larger flatbed truck, this one belonging to a commercial signage company, pulled up to 1445 Briarwood Lane. It was carrying the custom-designed sign. Rick and Mario, who had just arrived for the day's work, stopped dead in their tracks. The sign was massive, 8 feet wide, 4 feet high, made of polished, reflective aluminum, with the block letters rendered in a deep, imposing black and red. Marcus directed them to the top of the wall. Using specialized scaffolding, Rick and Mario began the delicate process of hoisting the sign. The moment the sign was bolted into place, centered perfectly on the bright yellow section of the wall, it completed the transformation. The wall was no longer just a wall. It was a monolith of defiance. The text, visible from every direction, screamed the bitter truth. Property protected by the cinder block fortress of 1445. Briarwood Lane. Enforcement by Marcus Thorne. HOA compliance rating, 100%. County standard. The reflective aluminum caught the sunlight, flashing the message across the manicured lawns. The reaction was instantaneous. A cluster of neighbors who had been watching from across the street burst into applause, a sudden scattered wave of cheering that carried down the quiet street. They weren't cheering the sign exactly, but the defiance it represented. Marcus felt a profound sense of closure. He had restored the balance of power. He had used the law to defeat the petty tyranny of the neighborhood aesthetic police. He walked inside, feeling the warmth of the rising sun on his back, knowing his battle was won. Powerful beat, karma, major turning point. Later that afternoon, Marcus was on the phone with his landscaper, discussing plans to install sound-dampening trees on the inside of his property, a double layer of privacy. The doorbell rang. It was Officer Miller, the same zoning officer from the day before, standing next to a severe-looking older woman in a pressed suit. The woman held a legal document in her hand. "Mr. Thorne, I apologize," the officer said, looking uncomfortable. "It seems we have a technical amendment. While the height of your structure is compliant with County R1 zoning, the County Fire Marshal's office has just issued an order due to the proximity of the structure to the main thoroughfare and its designated role as a visual distraction, specifically citing the fluorescent yellow paint and the reflective sign. Your structure is now in violation of visibility and obstruction code 8041C. The woman in the suit stepped forward, her voice a sharp professional monotone. Effective immediately, Mr. Thorne, the structure must be painted a neutral, non-reflective color, a muted tone approved by the County Planning Commission, or be entirely removed. This is not an HOA issue. This is a public safety order. Marcus stared from the lawyer to the officer, then back at the towering yellow and gray wall. He had been so focused on winning the HOA battle, he had completely forgotten that the government had a far wider rule book. His victory, the beautiful, blinding fortress, was now a public hazard, and the $15,000 settlement was about to be spent on compliance he never saw coming. The severity of the County Planning Commission lawyer, Ms. Hayes, was a chilling contrast to the petty tyranny of the HOA. Ms. Hayes didn't care about sightlines or shrub height. She cared about Code 804.1c, public safety, the reflective nature of the aluminum sign, and the chaotic distraction of the fluorescent yellow paint. She explained in a tone suitable for discussing tax returns. Posed a risk to drivers rounding the blind curve on Briarwood Lane. Marcus stood on his lawn, clutching the public safety order. His $15,000 settlement, his victory prize, was now a ransom payment. The county was not bluffing. Failure to comply within 5 business days meant not just heavy fines, but the physical demolition of the wall by a county crew with all costs billed to him, plus a lien. He immediately called Mr. Cohen. "They got us, Marcus," the attorney sighed. "The county is a sovereign entity. They trump the HOA, and they trump your zoning compliance. Your wall can be 10 feet, but if it blinds a driver, it's coming down. You have to repaint." "Repaint it what?" Marcus spat, staring at the blinding yellow. "Beige? Cream? Some pathetic shade of suburban compliance? The order is clear, neutral, non-reflective, muted tones. They'll send you an approved color palette. Look, Marcus, you won the war. You humiliated the HOA, forced a financial settlement, and got your revenge. This is just a cleanup operation. Paint the damn wall beige and move on." But Marcus couldn't move on. Repainting it beige felt like Brenda Sterling's final, posthumous victory. It would turn his fortress of defiance into a silent monument of his eventual defeat. He looked across the street. Brenda's curtains were slightly parted. He saw the faint outline of her silhouette. She was watching, savoring the justice of the universe correcting his arrogance. She had won the moment she contacted the fire marshal. The next morning, a thick envelope arrived from the County Planning Commission, containing a booklet of 30 approved, deeply depressing earth tone paint swatches, ranging from desert sand to misty clay. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, sipping coffee, staring at the swatches. They were the color of surrender. He felt the cold realization that he had played a short game of emotional revenge when he should have played the long game of bureaucratic chess. Then, an idea, cold and precise, began to form in his mind. He still had the wall. He had the structure. And he had $15,000. Compliance did not have to mean aesthetic capitulation. He didn't call a painter. He called a gallery owner he knew who specialized in large-scale urban art and trompe-l'oeil murals. "I need an artist," Marcus explained over the phone. "Someone who can paint masonry to look like something else, something hyper-realistic. And they have to be willing to work exclusively in the approved county palette." The gallery owner laughed. "You're asking for a subversive compliance mural." "I love it. I know just the guy. He's expensive, but he's a genius at spatial illusion." The 5th business day, the day of the county deadline, dawned clear and hot. The massive reflective sign had been taken down overnight, leaving only the 2 mounting holes in the cinder block. The scaffolding was up again, but this time there were no builders. There were 2 artists, a man named Julian with dreadlocks and paint-splattered overalls, and his apprentice, working meticulously with brushes, sponges, and airless sprayers. Brenda Sterling, of course, was on her porch watering her fern, having clearly canceled any appointments just to witness the final, inevitable humbling. She watched as Julian applied the approved colors, a base of misty clay, then layers of deep olive, and rustic bark. Just paint it the recommended color, Marcus. Brenda finally called out, unable to contain herself. Her voice was laced with a venomous sweetness. Why waste the settlement money on this theatrical display? Just give us the neutral wall we deserve. Marcus walked out onto his lawn, his hands in his pockets. The mural was half finished, and already it was breathtaking. I am giving you a neutral wall, Brenda, Marcus replied, his voice calm but projecting perfectly across the dead air between them. I am using only colors approved by the County Planning Commission. This is a work of art, and it is a work of compliance. It's a waste of $15,000, she sneered. It cost $1,498 to be exact, Marcus corrected. But it's worth every penny. By 3:00 p.m., the county zoning officer, Officer Miller, pulled up, accompanied by Ms. Hayes. They exited their car, clipboards in hand, ready to issue the final fines. They stopped at the corner of the wall and stared. Julian had worked a miracle of illusion. The 7-foot 4-inch cinder block wall, using only approved muted greens, browns, and gray-beige tones, was now covered in a stunningly realistic, trompe-l'oeil mural of Marcus's original 8-foot English laurel hedge. It wasn't a cartoon hedge. It was photorealistic. Every leaf, every branch, every shadow was painted with such meticulous detail that from 20 feet away, the concrete structure vanished. It looked like the original hedge was still there, healthy, dense, and towering, only rendered in slightly muted, non-reflective, county-approved paint. Marcus walked up to Ms. Hayes, who was running her fingers across the painted surface, clearly confused. Ms. Hayes, Marcus said politely, the structure is 7 feet, 4 inches. The color palette is 100% compliant with the approved earth tones chart. It is non-reflective. It is a work of art that, while visually arresting, is classified as a landscape mural, which is explicitly exempt from the sign ordinance. Ms. Hayes studied the document, then the mural. It looks like a hedge. That was the artistic intent, Marcus confirmed. To use a compliant, non-reflective medium to replace the aesthetic value that was unjustly destroyed. Ms. Hayes, a woman ruled entirely by code and paperwork, had no code to fight hyper-realistic compliant artistry. She looked utterly defeated. She exchanged a few words with the zoning officer, signed a form, and handed Marcus the final document. Compliance achieved, she stated flatly, then got back into the car. Marcus turned around to see Brenda Sterling. She had dropped her watering can. Water was pooling on her lawn. She was staring not at Marcus, but at the wall. Her victory turned into a permanent, detailed, silent, and entirely legal monument to her crime. She had wanted to force him to look at compliance. Now she had to look at a ghost of the privacy she destroyed every day in perfect, muted, non-reflective detail. Brenda, Marcus called out, a genuine, easy smile finally replacing the cold rage. Since the HOA paid $15,000 for the replacement, I decided the community deserved a permanent, maintenance-free, county-approved hedge. Think of it as a memorial, she didn't reply. She couldn't. The anger had drained from her face, replaced by a terrible, paralyzing horror. Karma, irony, major turning point. As the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the neighborhood, Marcus walked up to the wall and, using a small, subtle brush, painted one final, perfectly compliant detail on the trompe-l'oeil trunk of the imaginary hedge. He painted a small, almost invisible, brass plaque at eye level, which, upon closer inspection, bore 3 simple words, Brenda's last cut. Brenda, still standing frozen on her porch, watching him, finally screamed, a high, ragged sound of pure, unadulterated, impotent rage. It was the sound of a woman realizing her petty power had led only to her eternal, quiet humiliation, painted in permanent, compliant beige. She had exchanged a living, temporary boundary for a perfectly rendered, permanent, $15,000 ghost of her victim's dignity. Marcus was finally free. His house was quiet, shielded by an illusion of green. But her house, her conforming, quiet home, was now framed by a monument to her greatest failure. The trompe-l'oeil mural was no longer just a wall. It was the defining landmark of Northwood Estates. In the days following its completion, the neighborhood became a study in polarized reactions. Cars drove slowly, not in horror, but in fascination. Some residents, long stifled by Brenda Sterling's aesthetic tyranny, saw the hyper-realistic painted hedge as an act of artistic rebellion, a silent, beautiful defiance. Others, primarily Brenda's long-term allies and the old guard, viewed it as a $15,000 piece of graffiti, a vulgar joke played on their property values. Brenda herself was a ghost in her own home. She had not left her property line since the mural was completed, but her routines had become warped by the presence of the towering faux green surface. She refused to use the back patio, which was now overshadowed by the concrete monument to her failure. She took her coffee on the front porch, staring rigidly ahead, refusing to acknowledge the painted surface that haunted her peripheral vision. Worst of all was the tiny, perfect brass plaque, Brenda's last cut, placed just where her favorite rosebush used to bloom. It was subtle enough that a casual passerby might miss it, but for Brenda it was a searing insult, a daily, private torture administered in compliant beige. The HOA, meanwhile, was in chaos. Harold Jensen, the president, and Sarah, the treasurer, were facing a fiscal revolt. The $15,000 settlement payment had emptied the reserve fund, which was supposed to be used for the new community pool deck. Angry emails and phone calls flooded the management office. The core issue wasn't the ugly yellow paint, which was gone, but the gross mismanagement and legal negligence that forced the association to pay such a high price for a fence they already hated. Marcus received a polite, almost desperate call from Harold. "Marcus, we need your help. Not to take down the wall, it's brilliant, frankly, and compliant, but to save the HOA. Brenda is drafting a 20-page amendment on visual blight and material deception, specifically targeting murals. If this passes, it will give her more power than ever. And you want me to do what, Harold?" Marcus asked, trimming his own front yard boxwood. "Deliberately maintaining a pristine, compliant height. We need a vote of no confidence in Brenda as ARC chair. We need a community-wide meeting. And we need you to present the facts, the financial facts. You're the only one she can't intimidate," Marcus agreed. His initial goal was privacy and revenge. His new, more satisfying goal was to excise the poison from the community's heart. The extraordinary general meeting was scheduled for a Saturday morning in the community clubhouse. The room was packed, every seat filled, with standing room only in the back. The air was thick with tension, far exceeding the usual drama over sprinkler schedules. Harold opened the meeting, his voice tight. "We are here to discuss the status of the Architectural Review Committee, specifically the actions that led to the extraordinary expense regarding the boundary dispute at 1445 Briarwood Lane." Brenda, dressed impeccably in a power suit, took the floor immediately, seizing control. She launched into a passionate, rehearsed defense. "This is a witch hunt, an attack on our aesthetic standards," she cried, pointing dramatically toward the back of the room where Marcus stood. "I acted decisively to remove a non-compliant, dangerous, invasive hedge. My actions were for the good of the community's appearance. And now, the vandal, the man who built a fluorescent fortress, has bankrupted us, all so he could paint a ridiculous, childish picture. We must vote to ban all future murals and demand the wall be demolished." A ripple of murmuring went through the crowd. Brenda's voice had power. She was turning the narrative back to Marcus's initial defiance. Harold looked at Marcus, who nodded slightly. Marcus walked to the front. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't attack. He held a large, printed copy of the HOA's $15,000 settlement check. "Brenda calls this a ridiculous, childish picture. I call it a permanent, maintenance-free, county-compliant replacement that cost us exactly $14,800 of your community dues," Marcus stated, his voice calm and clear. He didn't talk about the hedge or the aesthetics. He talked about liability. Brenda's decision to commit trespass and property damage on my land, without legal recourse or due warning, exposed every homeowner here to a massive liability lawsuit. She did this because the hedge was 1 foot too high. My attorney was prepared to sue for $25,000. That's $10,000 more than we paid. We paid the $15,000 settlement to avoid a catastrophic loss of $50,000 to $100,000 in legal fees and damages. He held up the settlement check. This check is not a payment for a mural. It is a ransom paid to keep the association solvent, paid directly because of Brenda Sterling's reckless and unauthorized actions as ARC chair. She did not protect your property values. She put a lien risk on every home here. Sarah, the treasurer, stood up, tears welling in her eyes. He's right. The reserve fund is empty. We are legally exposed. We cannot afford another mistake like this. The murmuring stopped. The aesthetic argument dissolved instantly when confronted with financial reality. The community members looked not at the mural but at the empty lines in the HOA budget. The vote of no confidence was called. The result was overwhelming. 110 votes for removal, 12 votes against, mostly old ladies who still thought Brenda was a pillar of the community. Brenda Sterling was summarily, publicly, and legally removed from her position. Brenda didn't wait for the meeting to end. She grabbed her purse and walked out, her back stiff, her perfect facade finally cracking. Marcus watched her go, feeling a quiet satisfaction. His privacy was restored, his money was recovered, and the tyranny was over. 3 weeks later, the for sale sign went up on 1446 Briarwood Lane. Brenda couldn't live next to her monument. The daily humiliation was too great, the loss of power too absolute. She packed up her immaculate home and sold it quickly, eager to escape the permanent reminder of her failure. Marcus didn't see her leave. He was too busy enjoying the silence behind his maintenance-free, compliant trompe-l'oeil hedge. He had won. Ultimate justice, karma, final turning point. 6 months passed. The community slowly healed. The new ARC, headed by a genial passive man named Tom, became known for its laxity. Marcus was a quiet hero, and his wall, now a minor attraction, was left untouched. One sunny afternoon, Marcus was on his lawn when a moving truck pulled up to 1446 Briarwood Lane. The new owners arrived, a young couple, both artists, who looked exactly like the type of people Brenda would have detested. The next day, Marcus watched as the new owners, delighted by the mural's backstory, submitted their first ARC request. It wasn't to paint their house an approved beige or white. It was a request to paint their home a complementary shade of deep ocean blue with magenta trim, a color scheme that would have instantly triggered Brenda's heart palpitations. The new, terrified and fiscally conservative HOA board, under Tom's leadership, couldn't risk a single legal fight. They had no bylaw against the mural, and they had no leg to stand on against a slightly vibrant house color. The request was approved. Brenda Sterling, now living in a meticulously regulated, dull, and far less powerful HOA community 3 towns over, decided to drive by her old neighborhood one final time, needing the bitter comfort of seeing her defeat. She slowly rounded the bend onto Briarwood Lane. She saw the perfect, hyper-realistic mural of the English laurel hedge, still standing 7 feet tall. It was a permanent memory of her arrogance. Then she looked at her old house. Its facade was a jarring, joyful combination of deep ocean blue and electric magenta. It looked like a tropical bird had landed in Northwood Estates. The new colors perfectly framed Marcus's trompe-l'oeil hedge, completing the defiant, artistic, and entirely compliant picture. Brenda slammed on the brakes, her heart seizing with a final catastrophic horror. Her pursuit of absolute conformity had resulted in the neighborhood's ultimate irreversible slide into artistic chaos, starting right next door to her old lawn. She had not only lost her power and her money, but she had lost her aesthetic legacy. Marcus hadn't just built a wall. He had triggered the permanent downfall of Northwood's aesthetic tyranny, and the only evidence of her life there was a tiny brass plaque on a painted hedge. She put the car in reverse, never looking back, finally driven out by the beautiful, perfect irony of her own creation.